British Egyptian Society.
Noel, thank you very much for that. And can I welcome you all this evening to this Sir Michael Weir lecture. I'm sure that virtually everybody in the room knows about Sir Michael Weir, but for anybody who is here who is not familiar with the genesis of this lecture, Michael Weir was British ambassador to Cairo in the 1980s, and he was the founder of the British Egyptian Society. He was the most wonderful advocate for the relationship between the United Kingdom and Egypt. Very sadly for all of us, he died just before our great conference, which was marking the end of the Suez war, I suppose, in the 1950s that we held in 2006. But he gave us enormous encouragement in that conference that we had, and he was a fantastic inspiration to all of us. So we hold this lecture in his honour and in honour of his wonderful wife, Hilary Weir, who was, of course, also a great inspiration to everybody, and who died very sadly, very shortly after Michael. And again, you know, that was perhaps a mark of the enormous bond between them, that she did die so soon after he did, and she was a wonderful woman and, again, a great supporter of the relationship. So, we are now looking forward to the lecture that Charles Clarke is about to give us, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Charles here this evening. Charles is a colleague of many years standing, and of course, as you all know, was a major political figure. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, I first came across Charles when we were both undergraduates at Cambridge. He read maths and economics at King's College. I was doing something much more straightforward, history at Girton. But he, of course, was president of the Cambridge Students' Union, and later, and very celebrated, president of the National Union of Students. But I have to tell you, he cut a formidable figure when we were at Cambridge. I remember once walking down the road behind Charles, and he was wearing the most stupendous pair of bright purple velvet trousers. And in those days, he had ringlets down to about here. He had the most wonderful head of hair, Charles, at that stage. And my gosh, and he was bouncing down the road with such force and such determination that he was really a sight to behold and a great joy to see. Well, a few years passed, and my next real encounters with Charles was during the 11 years that he worked with the former leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock. He was originally a researcher, and then, of course, he became a chief of staff, and really one of the pivots around which that whole operation of Neil Kinnock's operated. He was a hugely, and remains in many ways, but at that point, that was the beginning of his hugely influential political career as opposed to his student days. And of course, it was then, I think, that he became to be recognized as having an acutely perceptive turn of mind, a wide range of interest, and terrific, really terrific analytical powers. Now, a lot of people have those things, but what they don't have is good judgment. And the thing that Charles brought to bear on having all that intellectual capability was also having very good judgment, which is a very different thing. He coached me for various TV appearances that I did when I was General Secretary of the FDA. I must have to say, he terrified the wits out of me with the instructions I had about things, don't do this, do that, you know, and I would go on. But his ideas and his ways of approaching things were absolutely brilliant. And his advice was always the same: stay accurate and never overstate your case. Brilliant advice. He then set up his own PR company dealing with a whole range of different public sector issues, and he re-entered politics at the time of the 1997 election. He was Education Minister in 1998, Home Office Minister in 1999, Party Chairman 2001, a difficult thing to be in the Labour Party, a little bit more difficult now than then possibly, and he was Secretary of State for Education in 2002 and Home Secretary in 2004. He has always had a passionate interest in foreign affairs. It was under his period as Secretary of State in the Department of Education that he instituted the big conferences of education ministers internationally that took place in London, and which has been such an important gathering together across a whole range of different countries of education ministers. Well, of course, Charles left government and he later lost his seat in Norwich. I have to say that he lost his seat in Norwich because the voters of Norwich believed that the Liberal Democrats really wouldn't put up university tuition fees. They went to the extent of even signing pledges to say they wouldn't. But there we are, so much is the state of politics. Since then, Charles has written many books. He has spoken for us at our conference that we had a few years ago with Tessa Blackstone, who I'm delighted to see here as well, Baroness Blackstone. And he is now a visiting, or you have been, Charles, I don't know whether you still are, a visiting professor at the School of Political, Social and International Studies at the University of East Anglia, visiting professor on politics, philosophy and religion at Lancaster University, and of course a council member of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Charles has a wonderful wife, Carol, two terrific sons, Matthew and Christopher. And as I said, he was a great support to us, along with Tessa, at our conference that we held back in 2012. He is a man of very high principle, even though he does, I think, now support Norwich Football Club. And Charles, I have to say that after the fantastic success of our former colleague Ed Balls in Strictly Come Dancing, we're all waiting with keen anticipation to see what next year's invitations will hold. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague, but most importantly, my very, very dear friend, Charles Clarke.
Well, Liz, thank you for that very extraordinary introduction. I don't remember everything you've described in our history. And perhaps I shouldn't regale the audience with my descriptions of you at Cambridge and the, how shall I say, very dramatic role that you played as you walked around the streets of Cambridge. But you're quite right to say that we've been very, very good friends ever since then in many, many different ways, and I appreciate the warmth of your introduction very much indeed. I also appreciate being invited to come and address this meeting this evening. The topic I've chosen is the future relationship between the UK and Egypt in a rapidly changing world. It's an honour to follow a most distinguished list of previous lecturers, mainly with immense experience in diplomacy and foreign affairs, which I don't have. I come from a very different angle with my governmental experience, mainly, as Liz said, in education and home affairs. But I don't have a great deal of experience with Egypt and North Africa. I did visit Cairo with Neil Kinnock, who was then leader of the Labour opposition, in February 1988. Sir James Adams was then the UK ambassador at that time, and it was part of a visit to the region to try and understand much better how we should work in those circumstances. I then visited as Home Secretary in February 2006, when Sir Derek Plumley, a previous lecturer in this series, was ambassador. And I was addressing security issues in a number of countries across North Africa, and very interesting meetings we had in Cairo indeed. Since leaving Parliament in 2010, when I lost my seat, I became a member of the Alexandria Trust, founded by an Egyptian businessman, which seeks to promote education in the Arab world. And in that capacity, I paid various visits to Cairo and Alexandria, including a very exciting for me visit to the Alexandria Library, and met the leadership of it, and that was a very inspirational thing to do. And we tried to establish, with Tessa's help actually, stronger relations between the Alexandria Library and the British Library here, which Tessa leads. And it's an inspirational place. And as Liz said, for just over a year, I've been a member of the Board of Trustees of the British University in Egypt, and I was a participant in the British Council Hammet Conference in 2014. So though I lack the expertise of most of the people in the room this evening, I do hope that I can claim some understanding of this relationship, and I do have a real commitment to building and strengthening the relationship between the UK and Egypt, which I think is particularly important at this time of epoch-making global change. So what I want to do this evening is first to set out the general background against which I think the current and future relationship between the UK and Egypt has to be considered. Second, I'll set out how I think that the European Union should be dealing with North Africa and with Egypt in particular. Thirdly, I will consider what the impact of the Brexit vote may be and how the UK should respond to that in relation to its relationship with Egypt. And then finally, I want to talk about the necessary substance of the UK-Egypt relationship, and in particular, the importance which I believe that education should have in that future relationship. I believe education internationally is extremely important in general, but I think for the UK-Egypt relationship, it's particularly important. I want to say a few words on that. So I'm very grateful to have the chance to discuss this in this gathering this evening. So first, the overall background within which all this has to be considered. I don't think there's really any escaping the sense of the ending of an era and a very uncertain journey into the new one through which we're all living. I'm sure 2016 will be marked as an important year in history in trying to understand what's happening to the world in which we are. The rise of globalization with its threats to the established ways of living across the world has provoked a powerful political response, most notably recently through the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump as US President. There may well be more responses yet to come as a form of so-called post-truth politics replaces rationality and classic liberal values with a powerful and emotional surge of rejection of the ways in which things have been done. The defenders of the existing order have so far proved incapable of resisting this challenge and have simply not been able to find ways of protecting those who feel threatened by the onward march of globalization, let alone enabling them to benefit from the, I think, generally demonstrable benefits of this approach, but many communities, many people feel very threatened and exercised by it. The background is straightforward. The post-1945 settlements in international relationships and cooperation, the establishment of the UN, NATO, EU, and so on, the establishment of welfare states and social protections in many countries throughout the world, which has happened over that period, and the development of free trade promoting economic growth-oriented priorities to generate prosperity have become excessively strained over this period since 1945. The institutions, for example, the UN, NATO, the World Trade Organization, the EU, have proved insufficiently capable of addressing the problems which societies face across the world. And as the future challenges become increasingly complicated and the solutions more difficult, people have lost confidence in those institutions to be able to address the issues they face, and politics and governments have seemed to focus on the increasingly trivial at the expense of the truly important and significant in lots of different ways. The way I myself see the international power relations to have changed is that from 1945 to 1989, we were living in a Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union as the two world powers in whose shadow everything else, including in Europe and North Africa, was formed. From 1989, that two-power world changed to a single world power, the United States, as after the end of the Cold War, it was the United States with the weapons and the determination to try and dominate the world and with no real rivals, which was the unchallenged dominance of the world, and people looked to it to try and provide a secure world. But then, I personally estimate from about November 2006, the midterm congressional elections in George W. Bush's second term, the United States changed as the American people signaled following Iraq and Afghanistan that they didn't want to pursue this course of a world domination by the United States. That was the mandate given in 2008 to Barack Obama, which he has followed relatively straightforwardly through his presidency. Under his leadership, the United States has been very wary of further foreign entanglements, including in the Arab world. So we moved from a state of affairs of a two-power world following 1945 to a one-power world following 1989 and the end of the Cold War to a zero-power world from 2006 to date. The trend has been continued and exacerbated by the election of Donald Trump with his highly insular, anti-internationalist approach and stance, and also the success of the Brexit vote in the UK, both of which may be followed by other shocks. Everybody obviously awaits the French presidential elections next year, and even before then, the Italian referendum in December in the next couple of weeks. Both those Trump victories and that Brexit vote reflected the victories of, I would say, inward-looking and retreat from the world politics against those who tried to feel that we needed to have a wider approach to things in these circumstances. But of course, the zero-power world that I've described is an invitation to other powers to move into the vacuum, as we've seen with the increasingly aggressive attitude of Putin's Russia and the developing Chinese position internationally as it moves into strong positions. And of course, from early 2011, the Arab Spring had of course begun to change the whole political culture of the region, with consequences which were yet to be understood and still have to be understood, I think, but within a context of the great power vacuum which I've described. The US, which had been a dominant force, was no longer the dominant force, and really had no desire to be the dominant force in North Africa and the countries that we're discussing this evening. So that's my overall background assessment. You may agree or disagree with the picture that I tell of it, but I think it's hard to disagree that this has been a period of enormous change as we move from this relatively stable state of affairs from 1945 until recently to a situation where there is really great uncertainty about what will happen in different ways. I'm not one of those. There are some, I've spoken at a couple of meetings recently, who believe it's all a disaster. The election of Trump is a disaster, Brexit is a disaster, we're all finished. I don't quite accept that view. I prefer to see them more in the nature of a wake-up call for those of us who've been associated with the previous way in which the world has been run, to say we've really got to get our act together, we've got to think much more clearly, much more effectively about what we do and how we convey that, and what I would say is a form of complacency has been punished by the electorates in this way, and it's up to those of us who believe in the values that we thought were important in that to really get out and make that case much more strongly, and this lecture is part of that this evening. But that is my overall background assessment against which we look at this, and against which I now turn to my second topic, how I think the European Union should be dealing with North Africa in general and Egypt in particular. In 2011, I wrote a pamphlet for the Centre of European Reform, this pamphlet of which I have a couple of copies if anybody's interested, called The EU and Migration, a Call for Action. This followed my experience as Home Secretary, which had led me to the view that migration had to be dealt with urgently, as early action could mitigate and even possibly prevent what was to come. And I think the signs were all there, actually. And if there'd been strong action by the European Union in a variety of different ways, we could have avoided many of the disasters there have been. But unfortunately, my advocacy in that pamphlet and elsewhere was not successful, and we've seen the absolute disasters of the last couple of years with so much immense human tragedy and loss of life and appalling states of affairs. But of course, apart from the tragedies themselves, which have been terrible, have had such dire political implications in countries both across the region and in Europe itself. One of the conclusions which I had drawn when I wrote this pamphlet, and I set it out in the pamphlet, was that the European Union as a whole needed, and the member states within the European Union needed, to pay far more attention to its southern border, by which I meant the Maghreb countries, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco, of which Egypt is probably the most significant, certainly in terms of population. And I believed and believe that the EU had not for many, many years given the attention to its southern border, which it needed to, in a variety of different ways. I specifically referred to the Maghreb countries, those 5 countries, and not other countries in the region such as Jordan, Palestine and Syria, though they're of course extremely important countries and very significant. Since I felt, and I still feel, that though the European Union should be playing a greater role in contributing to some form of Middle East peace process, however you define that, but including obviously in relation to Syria right now, I also thought then, and I think now, that it could and should make faster progress towards stability and security in focusing upon North Africa, its geographical southern border across the Mediterranean, whose significance has of course been dramatically demonstrated by the appalling and tragic refugee crisis in recent years. It therefore seemed to me, as I argue, and I argue it very much now, that it was imperative for the European Union to give at least as much attention to its southern border as it had given to the east after the end of the Cold War, where there was a significant set of issues, and in my opinion, one or two important misjudgments made by the European Union in relation to its eastern border. But the attention that was given to the eastern border still dominates. If you go today, as I did when preparing for the lecture this evening, to the European Neighbourhood Partnerships webpage of the EU site, it's still absolutely dominated by Ukraine and countries to the east rather than the south. And though it's all part of the European Neighbourhood Strategy, I think actually it still remains the case today that the importance to the European Union of its southern border is simply not appreciated. Of course, absolutely graphically demonstrated by the migration issue and the security issues which have come. But I think EU leaders haven't been prepared to give it the attention it needs. In one sense, of course, there was action. The NATO intervention in Libya, which lasted from March to October 2011, mainly led by the UK and France, though with the participation of 19 other countries, including the United States, was significant. However, the outcome of the military intervention, though successful in terms of regime change, was widely seen as unsatisfactory because there did not seem to be any clearly strategically thought out set of plans to follow that military conflict and to deal with the consequences of the military conflict. Indeed, the UK Parliament Select Committee on Foreign Affairs, in its report last September, this year, 2016, criticised David Cameron, then Prime Minister, for failing to develop a coherent Libya strategy, saying that UK strategy was based on erroneous assumptions and an incomplete understanding of the evidence, in particular about the position of militant extremist groups. And there were inadequate plans, they argued, the Select Committee, for stabilisation. Now, whether the Foreign Affairs Select Committee's conclusions were fair or not in their entirety, and I don't want to discuss that question in detail here since we're not talking specifically about Libya, I do think that the need for a coherent UK and EU strategy for their relationship with this region as a whole, including Egypt, has to go a long way beyond military intervention and has to seek a far more holistic strategy of engagement across a much wider range of issues. And that's my core argument in this lecture this evening. You can't just wait for a crisis, then send in some military intervention. You've got to have a long-term strategy looking at all aspects of the relationship and see how we can move things forward. And I think that has been true and is true and needs to be in future in a very strong way. In my opinion, the EU as a whole and its member states have not for some decades given high enough priority to their relationships with North Africa. The EU as a whole has tended to contract out the relationship to the big southern EU member states, notably Spain, France and Italy, with some understandable complications in former colonial relationships. The EU's European neighbourhood policy towards the North African countries, as I implied a second ago, was in my opinion inflexible, following a rigid template which bore little relationship to the individual circumstances of individual countries and was not sufficiently wide-ranging. And I believe it was almost a formalistic process of going through how they should deal things rather than really thinking about what the relationships were. I'm glad to say that I think this has started to change, and certainly the British have tried through diplomatic and other processes to try and change that, and I think there have been changes in that, but it's not gone yet, in my opinion, as far as it needs to go. Of course, recent events, most notably security and migration, though I should emphasise I've used those two words, that it's important to note that these are very different subjects. Some people try and elide security and migration into the same subject, which is in fact completely wrong and not the way to analyse it at all, in my view. But these two things have pushed concerns about the EU's southern border up the agenda of all European states, including the big European northern countries like Germany, the UK and Sweden. These events have made it imperative that the EU develops a comprehensive strategy to address the need to build stability and security across North Africa. It's obviously a difficult and daunting task, but the central goal, I would have thought, must be to support stronger societies and economies in each country, with less reliance on possible military intervention to do the trick in terms of security in these circumstances. Just to give a recent example, exactly the wrong way to address this was summarised by the German Interior Minister officials, who argue that migrants should be intercepted in the Mediterranean and landed in Egypt and Tunisia, who would then be required to build what they call supervised camps to house the returnees who had been caught on the ships in the Mediterranean, with EU funding and, if necessary, with an EU military assistance. This is a hopeless way of looking at this problem. Though it's quite widely held. I've been to a number of seminars about migration in this question. People say, set up a centre to service people in different countries without simply thinking through how it should be resolved. But I think this kind of transactional arrangement, which the Americans do with one or two countries in Latin America, by the way, of saying, okay, we'll do a deal with Egypt, we'll do a deal with Tunisia, of handing over the service centre for looking at refugees' rights to asylum claims and pay money and put our military troops in and all the rest of it, is just, to put it mildly, short-sighted and absolutely bound to fail. And I think that kind of transactional relationship to solve the problem would simply not succeed, and it's ridiculous that it should be proposed to do so. What's needed in contrast is what I've tried to argue earlier on, a wholesale effort to address the issues of trade, aid, economic development, security, which can lead to prosperity and growth and go right through this range of issues. Moreover, the EU's ambition cannot just mean the promotion of democracy, however that's defined. Democracy is a very weasel word in all of these circumstances. It covers the ability to change governments from time to time. I was interested talking about the election of President al-Sisi before the election actually took place with Mr. Sir Galdin, who runs the Alexandria Library. Some of you may know him. And he pulled off his bookshelf a copy of Thomas Jefferson's letters, in which it referred to the first establishment of the American Republic and the requirement for no American president to serve for more than 2 terms, i.e. 8 years, which wasn't actually set in the Constitution in America until after Roosevelt, much later on. But Jefferson made the case, and Mr. Sir Galdin was making the case to me, that it's very important if you get a military person coming in, that there are limitations and ability to be able to change as things move on. And his example was Jefferson. And though he was a strong supporter of President al-Sisi being elected instead of Mr. Morsi, he nevertheless thought that it was quite important to have some constitutional requirement. And of course, many of the countries we're talking about have had quite a difficulty in dealing with this question of transfer of power. Well, that's one aspect of democracy. Another aspect of democracy is fundamental rights for people, for example, rights for women, or rights to have a rule of law, and so on, a whole set of issues. So democracy is a very strange word to use in these circumstances. What exactly do we mean by democracy? Is it the Westminster model? Is it the American model? Or is it in fact something which reflects a whole set of different things? And there's a tendency to think we've kind of got to fight for democracy, and I don't think that's a very thought-through way of looking at the situation. It does mean, I think, the ambitions that the EU should have, trying to seek stable and secure borders, establishing a migration and visa regime which encourages trade and travel, which will in turn require reform within North African countries. Just to say, it can happen. The Western Balkan countries were given visa-free access to the Schengen zone just a few years ago, having gone through a great deal of process about how visas are issued and what would happen, but allowing a much more fluid set of relationships than would otherwise be the case. It does mean contesting organised crime and international terrorism, where a lot of important cooperative work is already being done. It does mean giving priority to promoting security and strong defence and foreign relations collaboration, including in relation to the media and to the military, and again, work's being done. It does mean building the rule of law and respect for fundamental human rights. That's a very important component of this whole approach. And crucially, it does mean re-evaluating Europe's economic relationship with North Africa, its trade and aid policies, with a view to promoting economic development and prosperity for the whole region, including in sectors like energy, oil, gas, infrastructure, tourism, and so on. And a lot of that is happening as well. It does mean fairer trade and agricultural reform, I would say, with steps to open European markets to North Africa for many of the things that are produced in North Africa. It does mean the promotion of high-quality education and skills, which is essential for success in these areas, and I'll return to that in a moment. And I do believe that development aid should be part of the overall package and not independent from it, with some development support conditional upon wider progress. So there's a long list of things that I think in this relationship between the European Union and North Africa need to be developed. It's not just odd events, odd collaborations, odd approaches, but a much more systematic approach right through. And I do believe the way to make progress in this direction is through a long-term strategic and holistic equal partnership, addressing all these issues, and not through a short-term European neighbourhood policy, which often tends to place our North African colleagues as supplicants and not as equal partners in the relationship, which I think is not the right way to go about trying to achieve the mutual respect and strength which one should be trying to foster. In all of this, I constantly run through my mind some words that were uttered by Baroness Usha Prashar, the Deputy Chair of the British Council, speaking at a Hammamet meeting in Tunisia 2 years ago, in answering the question, how can the European Union best help bring security, stability and growth in North Africa, subject to which she was addressing. She answered by saying, should it better be by boots on the ground or soft shoes on the ground? And the boots, of course, are for when it's all gone wrong. The soft shoes are trying to stop it going wrong in the first place. And, of course, for repairing the situation after military conflict, if that's possible. That was the purpose of the model for all this, the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, which did so much to create the era of stability from which we've all benefited. But it does say, don't just think that military is your way through. You've got to find a much wider range of relationships in all respects. And I think she was right that it should be the soft shoe policies which help to build a strong, sustainable, resilient, prosperous society in North Africa, which can live in good cooperation with its neighbours to the north. Is it a utopian, too idealistic view, maybe? Some of you more cynically may say, well, what's this all about? Surely everybody wants this, but it can't happen because of the conflict of a variety of vested interests. I don't think it is too utopian. I think there is a will to try and find ways forward in these kinds of areas. And of course, at the end of the day, building substantial, effective economic, social, political relations, security relations, is a lot cheaper for everybody than going through the whole armed intervention approach when things come along in different ways. Harder work in some ways, but a necessary thing to do. Now, of course, in the countries I've spoken about, the 5 Maghreb countries, the position's enormously different in each of the countries we are discussing. The challenges vary immensely. The EU, in developing the big strategy, which I believe to be essential, has to look at each country and the ways in which the relationship will evolve. But I think the relationship with Egypt is particularly important, with very wide implications. So to my third topic, the impact of the Brexit vote and how the UK should respond to that in regard to its relationship with Egypt. Of course, the UK remains a member of the European Union, though some seem to have forgotten that, with great uncertainty about the timetable of departure. My own view is that the incompetence of Theresa May and her team, if team is not too generous a word to use, is steadily making it more likely that Brexit will not actually take place, or at least not for a very long time. I started out thinking there was a 10% chance it wouldn't happen. I now think it's about a 20% chance it won't happen, because the process of Brexit is so complicated and so difficult that it does require a lot of competence and ability to get it right. And so far, the May team is not scoring 10 out of 10 in that regard in a large number of ways. And of course, we have no idea in any case what form of Brexit it will be and what form of relationship the UK will have with the single European market, with the common agricultural policy, the customs union, freedom of movement of labour, and the balance between them all. And the future UK-Egypt relationship will depend somewhat upon the precise new form of association between the UK and the EU, which actually emerges in due course further down the line, because what the UK is in and what it's not in, if I can put it like that, will have an implication on the relationship that the UK can develop with Egypt and indeed with other countries. All that said, I have little doubt that both the UK and the rest of the EU will want to work very closely together on foreign policy. And I even believe that institutional arrangements may well be established to facilitate that. For example, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, the former Foreign Secretary, has suggested some kind of EU and UK Foreign Policy Council. In general terms, I expect the UK and the EU to work jointly in their approaches to the EU and Egypt to North Africa. However, if the UK does leave the EU, it will have more flexibility to develop bilateral relations, and I would expect them to do this, notably on trade and aid, on security generally, and on education, to return to that. I'd certainly encourage this, and I think there's a good appetite for it, which brings me to my final point this evening, the substance of such a relationship. And I would like to focus here on education, where I understand that the UK has become Egypt's partner of choice for education, which I very much welcome. I believe that's happening in other countries in North Africa as well. I was in Tunis last year, talking to their ministry officials in a number of education departments, and I said to them very directly, are you sure you want to work with the UK? What about the Francophone tradition, the way you've operated, and so on? And the UK's got a very different approach. No. We really want to work with the UK on education. We think that's the place to be, and I think that's the attitude which one hears people here in the audience may support or otherwise what I'm saying from Egypt as well. The desire to work with the UK in these areas. It's something which your association has worked very hard to promote, for example, at that conference you had, but more generally. And I think that's the key thing. Collaboration in the area remains central to the bilateral relationship, but my argument here is that very much more needs to be done. The UK's engagement is already intended to demonstrate a commitment to partner at the individual, institutional and systemic level, as well as holding a shared vision of Egypt's future for the emerging generation. There are already a number of cooperations in place, notably in the field of higher education. A broad memorandum of understanding was signed by Foreign Minister Shukri and Philip Hammond, our Foreign Secretary, in December last year, December 2015, supporting large-scale reform across the higher education system. In addition, commitments to the Newton Musharraf Fund were recently increased, now representing a £50 million investment in science, research and innovation over the next 5 years. Institutional links continue to grow, with 30 agreements to be signed this year alone. I remember, Tessa, when you were Vice-Chancellor of Greenwich University, you had an established relationship with university in Cairo, and it was a pioneering one at that time to try and make that relationship go. But over 30 agreements to be signed this year alone, and over 16,000 Egyptians studying for degrees associated with British higher education institutions. New partnerships are being built around primary, secondary and technical education, including a contract to train 37,000 teachers in the public sector, increasing numbers of students taking UK qualifications, and a project to improve educational outcomes across the school system. Cambridge Assessment has had an interesting project with Nile Egyptian schools to develop high-quality schools in the country. The programme of Chevening scholarships continues to develop. So there are a range of different collaborations which are happening. This all builds on a history which includes technician training schools, twinning arrangements, through which British and Egyptian teachers worked on new curricula, teaching methods and equipment in a wide range of engineering subjects. It extended to new technician partnerships, for example, in building trades, petrochemicals, diesel, mechanical, electrical, agriculture, shipbuilding, marine, refrigeration. These links produced the historic relationships, produced standards and curricula for new skills in Egypt, but developed ways of working in international technical education which were innovative and had a wider impact than on the individual schools involved. The need for cooperation on vocational education, training and skills remains particularly important, and people are looking to try and find ways to really make that happen, and important and interesting projects are being considered. However, in summary, what I want to conclude in arguing this evening is that education cooperation at all levels needs increasing support. We shouldn't be satisfied with what is being done, even though there are some very good and positive things there. More is needed to be done. I've no doubt myself that the will is there on all sides. I've spoken to so many people in different ways who tell me they want to make this happen and want to make it go. I'm certain the British government wants to work well in these areas and has been giving priority to this, is also keen to develop educational cooperation with other North African countries, as I've said. I believe the Egyptian government and other education institutions in Egypt are also keen to build cooperation, and that too extends to other North African countries. However, I think we've still got to find the key to make this potential collaboration really buzz. I think it's there and it's worthwhile, and there's some good projects there, but I don't think it's got the vitality it yet needs to really take it into a different level. And I think that's something the UK in particular can help with the Egyptians to establish in a way that could be extremely powerful. Of course, more resources, public and private, would help. They're always important to these things. But even more important is a high level of commitment from UK education institutions to collaborate with Egyptian colleagues to help to make a difference. I've often been disappointed with that. There are a lot of very inward-looking attitudes in British universities about collaboration with other countries overseas. People are very worried about human rights issues and issues of this kind, which I think misses the absolute core point. It is through educational collaboration that change happens in a very positive way. It's not through confrontation and drama. I always think, just to give a bigger, rather different example, the end of the Cold War happened as it did, more as a credit of Willy Brandt and the Helsinki policies and so on, than of Reagan, Thatcher and cruise missiles. There was a dialogue, détente, which enabled the conflict to be resolved in a way that was relatively peaceful and relatively constructive. But it's not often seen quite like that. I argue positively for collaboration across into different social and political systems, and I think that's the better way to go, and education is a great key for that. But it remains the case that there are people in British universities who don't take that view. They think the whole world should be rather like Britain, and if that was the case, it would all be okay, which is not actually my view of the way that things are, proud Briton though I am. So we need more talking, more long-term collaboration, and less short-sighted approaches. So I think the future of UK-Egyptian educational relationships has to be a long-term commitment where not just countries, governments, but institutions work together in a very collaborative way. And I think there's a lot to be gained on all sides of the discussion. I think the skills are all there to help transform the educational opportunities for educating young people and so not just educating an elite. That's another issue, of course, for much international education. There's a focus on the international schools, so-called, and on an elite middle-class education aspect of things, which is important. I'm not against it. But actually the big educational developments arise when you're talking about a whole population and raising educational standards for everybody right across the whole range, which is a very, very difficult ask, of course. But it's one where I think the UK can help contribute. I think it's a particular strength that the UK can offer to be able to do this. I would say, hopefully within the context of what I talked about earlier, a decision by the whole European Union to give a far higher priority to seeking a better and comprehensive strategy priority to their overall relationship with North Africa. You need the holistic approach that I've described. I would hope the UK would encourage that holistic approach by the EU as a whole and participate in it quite whatever the UK's relationship with the EU actually turns out to be. But I do think there's a particular dimension that the UK can bring to this, which is the educational collaboration to make it work. Other areas are also important and can be developed. Issues of security and so on are important. But I do believe education is the key. And Liz, that's really my core message for this evening. The UK-Egyptian relationship is extremely important as the world is changing so dramatically in so many different ways. I think the EU has to push its southern border right up the agenda, as I say, try and have a much more systematic approach rather than a bit of a spatchcock approach. But I think within it, the UK has an immense amount to contribute to the educational relationship, to work with our colleagues and friends in Egypt. And I think there's a desire to do that, but we have to work harder to make that happen. Thank you for the chance of making that discussion this evening.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our Vice Chairman, Professor Magdi Ishak-Hanna, will give the vote of thanks and also chair the Q&A session, which will go on until 8:30. That's not 8:31, it is 8:30, because at 8:30, Baroness Simons will make a short presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody, and Charles, thank you very much. I mean, I found that very interesting and intriguing, and particularly the three dimensions you talk in your talk, and basically the vacuum which created after the Cold War and after the domination of the United States, vacuum of the leadership. And basically, then you talked about the European Union and its role, and its duty more than its role, really, to look into its southern neighbor across the Mediterranean. And I agree with you. I mean, it's been completely ignored. In spite, there was a very strong attempt called the Euromed initiatives and the Euromed agreement, in which basically Egypt and the French were trying to play the leading role, and that's probably why it didn't come to too much anyhow. I'm talking about the French. But then you really proceeded to talk to us about the bilateral relation. And I noticed really you kept referring to the EU-UK. And I hope you're right about that, and the Brexit will not have a fast momentum to end into a nasty divorce. But that's, in my part, a wishful thinking, because I think the timber. But what really, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, people really want to question you very hard about everything, and you really talked about that education is the most important issue in developing the relation, or the bilateral relation. And I agree with you on that, because basically when I was in primary and secondary school, I was taught, and in the medical school, I was taught according to the British system. And so my generation have a very strong link with Britain because the education system we grew on it. And I am a really strong believer that education creates more powerful relation between nations than any diplomatic initiatives or trade agreement or whatever it is. Because basically you instigating a culture which goes on in people way of thinking. So when these young people becomes in a position of power, they really draw in what they learned and their personal experience in, according to their education system. However, the bit which I may like to address with you, that both our politicians, the Western politician and the Western media, not only just disconnected with the public at large, they seem to be in a different world to what really the public want. I mean, the Brexit came as everybody as a surprise, even to the people who was really campaigning for Brexit. They were surprised that they won. And when they won, they didn't know what to do with it. The other thing, the election of Trump. And I remember the eve I was having dinner with Ambassador James, and he and some of the other prominent guests, they were saying, no way Trump will win. And so everybody thought the same. The media in the United States and in this country got it wrong, and after the result came, we're still trying to deny it, that it ever happened. But the truth is, we are disconnecting with the public. It's not only about really the liberal value against right-wing value. It is really more important about that people normal people, not just right-wing people, had enough of what called over-liberalism, political correctness. They just had enough of it. And they really want the pendulum to come to the middle again between really what is far right and what is far liberal. It is a view, and there is a true disconnection. It is my own personal belief, if this disconnection between what people want and what the politicians do is not addressed, will lead to serious consequences. And we've seen it now. All of a sudden, Francois Fillon is he represents the far right. He is winning, or he will be, according to all predictions, the next president of France. Angela Merkel is losing heavily, even in the local elections. In her own constituency, she lost to the far right. And the Austrian, in the 4th of December, going back for election, and my fear that the far right wing in Austria may win. Anyhow, I have said my bet, and now no one is smiling. And I would like really to raise the question, and to keep with the times, we'll take about 5 questions. We'll start with the lady, yes. No, you. Of course. Yeah, so you can see your accuser.
Hello, well, Charles, you know me. I was struck by how you made the argument. Sorry, Claire Spencer, Chatham House, and a trustee of the British Egyptian Society, with great honour. Charles, you urged us to separate security and migration, which is true, and it does get very muddled. However, there may be a reason for this. You didn't mention the concern, and in some cases obsession, in the EU with counter-terrorism. And I think one of the issues I have with promoting greater links with education is that it goes against a lot of what many European establishments are trying to do to combat terrorism, because if you're really going to enhance the educational experience of Egyptians, North Africans in general, they need visas, very young usually, from 18 onwards, to come into Europe. And that is exactly where foreign policy, which may be urging greater links between the country, comes across Interior Ministry concerns about the wrong people moving around. And education, it could be that the British organisations invest more heavily in education in Egypt, but it should be a two-way street. We should be seeing more Brits, young British students going and studying in Egypt, and the Egyptians coming here. And in this atmosphere of a huge priority being given to counter-terrorism, we hear the language in current British government policy to resilience. And everything has to be measured against radicalization and de-radicalization. How do you square the circle here? Because education necessarily requires greater openness and not the kind of controls we're seeing through an emphasis on counter-terrorism.
Okay, do you want me to deal with the one by one or go?
Yes, just, can I just take on sorry, we'll take 3 questions. Okay. Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed Muqaddam.
Yes. I have a few comments and then one major difference with you. First, it's not a zero power. It is a negative power, a generalization of constructive anarchy to the world at large adopted by Obama. That's the first point. The second point, Europe is, the EU is standing on one half-broken leg. It needs fundamental and structural changes in order for it to have the harmony and the homogeneity that would enable it to deal with its own southern border. Thirdly, you advocated a comprehensive, integrated relationship between Europe and North Africa and Egypt. To begin with, North Africa is one, and Egypt, the pivotal, is one. So we don't generalize borders. Egypt is the heart of the world, is the most significant country in that part, with 8 arms across the world. However, when you came to the relationship between Egypt and Britain, instead of advocating the promotion of the relationship in education that existed with Egypt for years, including myself and others, we were all educated by the British, you are now saying, we just carry on education. Why don't you talk about a comprehensive, integrated, special relationship between Egypt and Great Britain, the pivotal state and the great power? I believe that time, I may be told I am a traitor or I am a supporter of the colonial power that occupied Egypt for years. Yeah. However, I advocate a formal relationship between Egypt and Great Britain as not a special relationship like the ones Britain had with the Americans that had turned to become a historical relationship, a taken for granted relationship. But I believe if Egypt and Britain can formalize their alliance together, particularly now as Britain is coming out of the Brexit thing, I believe the formalization of a special relationship between Egypt, a pivotal state, not a border, Great Britain, a great power, that would lead peace, stability, and world prosperity. Thank you.
And that's the last question for now. Okay. Sorry.
It's a lot lighter. We've all enjoyed British education one way or the other growing up in Egypt. My question is, what are we doing about the cultural opportunities between Egypt and England now? Because of all the economic problems that Egypt is facing, cultural opportunities and events are almost a luxury to the majority of people. And while education is useful for those who don't know, there are people that used to know, but they're radicalized one way or the other. And it's opening the channel of communication with the slightly older generation, but are still young. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll just come to the rostrum here, Magdi. Let me just make a couple of comments just about what you said at the beginning. I agreed very much with what you said on most areas, but I also think the blow which has been given to the existing regime is an invitation to respond, and we are not yet responding, and that's what has to be done, so I agree with you. I'm less negative, by the way, about François Fillon. He was education minister when I was French education minister when I was Secretary of State here, and he paid a visit to the UK, and we had a very good couple of days going through things, most notably because his wife's name is Clarke, the same as mine. And so we were able to establish, she's Welsh, she's half Welsh, she comes from Monmouthshire, and there's a great dispute whether you consider that really Wales or not in the great scale of things. I think the reason why I didn't mention the Euromed, I thought of doing so, but I honestly thought that was a Sarkozy vanity project rather than a serious effort to develop the relationship. It was actually part of that process of subcontracting EU relations to those southern countries, in particular France, and it wasn't an all-EU engagement. I tried when I was Home Secretary to get a meeting of security ministers around the Mediterranean to discuss issues. It was simply absolutely impossible. You could never do that. And the Euromed became part, Sarkozy I knew well because he was Interior Minister when I was Home Secretary, and we had a number of entertaining discussions about particular aspects of our common approach to politics. But I don't think the Euromed was a seriously enough engaged concept on the European side. I can't speak of the Mediterranean side as to something which could take this forward. It could have been, in principle, something to take that in a more serious way.
But it was flagged to be.
Yes.
It was flagged to everybody to be.
Exactly. Let me firstly take Claire and Amanda's point. I understand the point you make, Claire, extremely well. In fact, institutionally, I understood it. In the UK, being an Education Secretary, then Home Secretary, that issue went on the whole time. I, for example, have always very strongly opposed the restrictions, and we didn't have them when I was Home Secretary, on international students coming to study in this country. There were some issues of so-called bogus courses, which, in my opinion, could be dealt with, and in fact, in general, were dealt with. But the Theresa May approach to try and stop international students coming to the UK really got down into a very narrow area, and that's the classic person-to-person thing that you're talking about. And you're quite right that it was because of security concerns, but most of the security concerns were actually complete nonsense, as I knew as Home Secretary as we went through it. There obviously was a risk that some people might try and use the educational route, but the question, could that be dealt with? Well, it could be dealt with, and it was dealt with. The issue is different, and I set it out in the pamphlet there, and we've actually, you and I discussed this before, is the question of what is the EU, the Schengen border? How serious is that as a border? And I think that that question needs to be resolved, and it is right for the EU, if that's going to be the common border, to try and exercise some real control over who comes through that border. Now, does that mean that exercising that control blocks the kind of relationships we're talking about? Well, the reason I gave the example in what I said about the agreement with the Western Balkan countries to have visa-free access to Schengen. They have visa-free access to Schengen, though not to the UK significantly. It was only, about 5 years ago that was agreed for Schengen. Following a long process of going through with those countries how they dealt with their own systems in a way that meant they had some control. I think I'm right in saying, I last looked at this properly about a year ago, so I may be out of time on this. The only issue that arose as a real issue was Roma travelling from Western Balkans up to Sweden and so on. And that was, again, actually a soluble problem. But I think it's entirely possible to imagine a border, particularly if the border is based on collaboration with the countries across the border, which was an insight that I got in writing that pamphlet from Frontex, to deal with the security issues there. You can't dispute there are security issues that are around. I don't quite accept your characterization that everybody in the EU is dominated by counter-terrorism. I think it's worse than that. I think the EU leadership has been frozen about what to do with this migration question and has not been able to discuss seriously what it should do for all kinds of reasons. An extraordinary, in my view, unprecedented thing. It's on the top of the agenda of each of those EU leaders for their own country, but they can't find their way through to talk about how you do it. They have, in my opinion, a completely batty approach to sharing people around. Angela Merkel, who I admire actually as a leader, I very much hope she's re-elected as Chancellor after the elections next year, I think misjudged how she handled the migration issue last year, for the best of motives actually, but actually with a set of consequences which in my opinion haven't been properly thought through. But my answer to your question fundamentally is we do want the educational exchanges. That is crucially important, and that has to overcome the security issues, because at the end of the day, as I was trying to argue, and I hope it came over in what I said, I think the security issues are best dealt with by relationships between peoples rather than by military-type intervention. Now, of course, there's a long-term, short-term issue there, and any Home Secretary, any Interior Minister has to be, and any Prime Minister has to take account of security threats. You can't just say, well, that's a long-term problem. Nor there are some people who argue fewer people who are killed in terrorist attacks than die on road accidents every year. We shouldn't really bother about terrorism. I don't accept that view at all. I think it's actually something that you have to deal with. But you're right, you can put it in the context of a wider approach. And that takes me to Amanda's point. I couldn't agree more about the cultural opportunities. Not just the media point that Magdi was making, which works against understanding of things. It's crucially important that people, through their own cultural experience, are able to understand what other cultures are, and by the way, what they're not. And that is a serious, serious issue, which at the end of the day, bottom line, is down to education systems, down to exchange, down to cultural exchanges, and so on. And the danger, what I think is so terrifying about the people's votes in the case of Trump and Brexit, is it's a victory for the inward lookers, the people who say we don't want to know about what's going on in the rest of the world. We don't want to take any responsibility for the wider society. And sorry, I'm talking too long, but I think that's a very dangerous thing. So those of us, I don't know if I call it liberal values or not, but those of us who think you do want to have a wider understanding have to work to make that happen. Ahmed, I didn't quite, I took a number of your points, I didn't quite get all of them, but the one I do want to disagree with is I don't think the UK can say Egypt is the only country that counts in this regard. Egypt is a very important country, maybe unpopular to say it here. Egypt is the most populous country, is in many ways historically the most significant country, and so on. But a country like the UK can't, and in my view shouldn't say, it's only the Egyptian relationship which counts, which is why I talk about North Africa as a whole. In fact, I would say that at the moment Tunisia is extremely important to have a relationship to deal with these kinds of issues. And so I wouldn't say that it's just an Egypt alone type approach, or I'm not actually a fan of special relationships. I never believed the UK-US special relationship ever existed, and I don't think it does now. But I don't think I just don't think that's how one should think about the world. I think we want good relationships across the whole range, and I wouldn't accept that Egypt is ahead of other countries from that point of view. Maybe more significant, and I could argue it is. But I don't think you can just say it's Egypt alone.
Thank you. Just I can take another time for another question, please. Any other question? Well, in this case, thank you very much.
Well, Charles, we've come to that point in the evening where you are, I hope, going to be the happy recipient of honorary life membership of the British Egyptian Society. It was a great... Sorry?
I said, wow.
Oh, wow. Gosh, I thought you... It was a great speech. I really was. And I just wished, you know, like so often when I hear very, very good speakers trying to write feverishly in order to plagiarize everything they've said. So I hope we'll get some copies of it, because we'd love to put it on our website, please. Thank you very much to those of you who asked questions. I think that's, you know, it's important to sort of test out what's been said to you. But Charles, it really was an exceptional tour de force, and thank you very, very much for giving up all the time it must have taken to prepare and for being with us this evening. It's been a huge pleasure having you here. So please accept our honorary life membership.
Well, I'm honoured. Thank you very much.